Kia ora tātou, everyone. So what I'm going to quickly do for you today is, in 10 minutes anyway, roll out how we went with the spatial plan and what it means for the city and why we do one. Primarily, what's it about? Spatial planning is it's a commonly accepted term, and you're seeing now the central government's even looking at pushing and trying to encourage people and cities to do spatial plans. But overseas, they've been happening for quite some time. They really start at looking at a city at about 40,000 feet and try to get it to understand itself, if you like, where it's growing, what its key constraints are and what its key opportunities are. And it is part of a broader program called Planning for Growth, started back in 2017 for Wellington. It was a bit of a regional conversation, mostly focused on Wellington and where it's going. We had a lot of submissions, about 1,500 to the Planning for Growth program. And that led into setting some high-level kind of goals, if you like, for the city as we move forward. It's a collection of effort, spatial plan being one. This leads into a full review of what we call a regulatory district plan. It's how we control the environment as it grows around the city. And then, of course, it is plugging into Let's Get Wellington Moving and Te Ata Kura, which is the council's and the community's endeavour to go the first to zero, the first to a carbon neutral city. The other thing that it includes and plays into, it's a two-way street there, is the regional growth framework. So as you know, the Wellington region itself, some of you may not even live in the city, has an east and a west growth spine out to Martin and Levin, and that corridor itself is close to sort of heading to the 500,000 mark, and we have rail links and bus connections, etc. So we are looking at a regional perspective about how Wellington as a hub and spoke serves the region over time. These were the key drivers, four kind of pillars, if you like. We are growing. You can cut and paste the population numbers as you choose. We have to start somewhere. We started with a $50,000 to $80,000 window based on some evidence we've built. Often and very frequently that's challenged, but we have to start somewhere. It's a progressive and a very, very high growth mode at the moment. And we continue to review that number. But institutions across, whether it's the banks or Treasury, all have different growth figures. These are the ones we've chosen. Now, despite COVID-19, our advice in terms of the consultants that are working for us and some of the foresight work we have in our research team are still saying that we expect a strong growth forecast. We do think the livability of Wellington, its position, will continue to have strong growth over time. The figures, of course, will change as I've discussed. The other thing, of course, is our housing platform, our housing issues. We have a burning platform from a housing affordability point of view. The central government's very, very focused on it, and that is part of the spatial plan's endeavour, which will feed into the district plan. How are we going to fit the people into the city that we need to, and how are we going to keep housing in a competitive, accessible price for residents? Everyone knows Let's Get Wellington Moving is a program of work that's going to deliver some transformational change to the city. This intensification is not only just about local centres, and I'll touch on in a minute, but it's also about the transport corridors that that program like that is going to create, and how do you build growth around that transport corridors to support it to be successful. And finally, and very, very importantly, this is a national growth agenda issue. So the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, every single city, provincial city in New Zealand are all having to tackle and understand what the NPSUD, the acronym, the National Policy on Urban Development, how that is going to affect how local councils plan their cities, but a very high bar to move towards from a central government expectation point of view. And I've talked a little bit about the Wellington Growth Framework. Those last two slides really relate to something we all know about, and it's very, very common, of course, which is commonly spoken about, which is sea level change and the impact of climate change in our coastal communities in particular, and of course this livability component. All of this has driven the making of the plan. The directions of the spatial plan, I've tried to distill on one slide. It's a complex piece. I think you heard Sean talk about how complex cities are to plan, but these sort of 6 dot points, if you like, is a summary of what we're trying to integrate into our local centres, but more broadly into the city. It does have a focus on the central city because we know that has greatest potential to grow in the short term. It has focused on our inner suburbs. There's been lots of debate about the impact of growth on our inner suburbs. And you would have, if you've been following it in the news, it's been a very, very polarising debate. It does focus on Johnsonville and Kilburnie as our metropolitan centres. We have two of them. If you think of a hierarchy, the CBD, Johnsonville and Kilburnie, that's our hierarchy, then the local centres sit below it, all of which need to talk to each other, whether it's by transport or by its population contributions as it's growing together as a city. And it does include greenfill and infill opportunities as well. Of course, I've talked about the integration. Let's get Wellington moving. Interestingly, when we started this work, and Sean's work's been very, very helpful, we have some huge infrastructure constraints. Put aside the hazard issues that Wellington inherits, whether it's coastal hazards or rupture zones and ground shaking issues. We have quite a substantial infrastructure deficit. You would have, again, if you paid attention, seen those issues as they're bursting out of the ground. But the point here is we are probably in the best position we've ever been in understanding what those deficits are and how we're going to try to invest and arrest it in the future. The Council's recent long-term plan was about catch-up. I think you'll find the next one will be about growth. Wellington Water has been given a mandate to discover what's wrong with the city and how we're going to fix it. And we're looking forward to seeing those fruits over the next 3 years. So this is probably the largest change for our outer suburban centres. The NPS has been very clear on our centres and where growth needs to occur. And I think the takeaway for this room is that your local centres will change. And they'll change in the sense that they're going to grow and they'll have more different types of housing in it and a lot more people walking the streets, hopefully walking past the shops and spending money and making it more vibrant, successful, prosperous. That's something, it's a takeaway that you do need to understand. This is the blueprint, the spatial plan, the one that was adopted by council in June. It's if you think about an architectural blueprint for the city, that's what that spatial plan was intended to do. We're now heading towards a district plan. As I say, this is the rule book. This is how we're going to control development over time, because at the end of the day, we're not the ones that grow centres, it's the market that grows it. But we want to make sure when these centres grow, we grow it in a sustainable way and we grow it in a really, really prosperous and effective way. You know, we don't want poor development outcomes. Put that aside, we're balancing central government policy on intensification and detailed design outcomes on the ground to make these centres as successful as possible. Those two things work together. The timeline at the moment, we've had a decision by council. They've adopted the spatial plan. It does talk to the long-term plan, which is, again, they adopted around the same time, that programs the infrastructure investment to support this growth over time. In October, November, we're looking to go out in what they call a draft district plan. So it's a non-statutory draft, but it's road testing the rules. So the blueprint's been locked in. Now we're in the rule phase, and we're going to road test those rules with the community. That's going to lead to this time, sort of May 2022 next year, we will actually go out, start the regulatory statutory process. We will start to a resource management-led proposed district plan where, you know, planning commissioners get involved. There's an independent referee. People make submissions. They challenge council. Council tries to provide some evidence as to why the decisions they're making, and ultimately there's a recommendation from an independent panel that then goes up ultimately through council and up to the minister for approval to adopt the district plan. The takeaway for us is Wellington is actually ahead of the curve here. We're the first council to legitimately adopt a spatial plan, and the first council under the new format planning schemes, and the NPS in particular for urban development. We're the first council to tackle that in a statutory instrument called the district plan. So for today, I think the important thing is there is lots of change happening. There's lots of expectations from central government on communities to try to find ways to grow in a sustainable way. And national policy is directing councils to try to make that happen as quickly as possible. And yeah, it's a pretty crazy place to work. It's a fast-paced, really exciting council. I can't speak highly enough of Sean, Martin. I want to introduce Claire and Mark now. If you can imagine these mornings' presentations from the city, you know, we started quite high at altitude and we're coming down to the ground level now. But, you know, the integration that we're seeing on the 17th floor of the council building, if someone did a tactical strike there, would lose the brains of the city, I'm sure. But it's a really, really good, exciting, integrated piece of work. But it's very, very challenging, and any sort of change is difficult, and you would have seen that play out in the media. But we have to change. It is absolutely important, both from a housing affordability point of view, but a sustainability concept as well, that we are in a really, really pivot point for changing and driving the city, and we're looking forward to working with the local centres and the bid programs to make sure those communities are prepared for it.